All right, well, let's go back to social media and
Awesome.
see what other questions are waiting for us.
So this is going to be a science question for Sam. David wants to know, how do viruses and bacteria differ?
Yeah, let me pull up a picture really quick. Okay, so this gets into sort of some existential questions about what is life? Like, is life defined by a certain set of characteristics? Viruses are often considered non-living, but biological components, whereas bacteria are considered living. I'm going to pull up just the difference between a virus cell and a bacteria cell. Give me just a second here. So, like us humans, bacteria are made of complete cells, and those cells are capable of doing all of the normal characteristics of life. They consume food and waste the food. They're able to reproduce completely on their own. And this is true whether you think of individual bacteria cells, like, for example, an E. coli bacteria cell that might be growing on some food that you shouldn't eat. And that's also true of the cells in my body and the cells in really any kind of animal or fungus or bacteria or protist. All of these types of living things are complete cells. And okay, we could jump to my screen. It's really not a fantastic picture, but that's okay, because it'll help me get my point across. So on the right side, we have a rod-shaped bacterial cell, and that there are all these different parts of a bacterial cell that we could point to, like the cell wall and the chromosome, the nucleus inside it with the genetic material. Viruses, on the other hand, are much simpler. In a sense, viruses are really just genetic packaging, or genetic information, like your DNA or my DNA, coded in protein, but then with really nothing else available to it. And these little virus packages, what they're actually doing is viruses are looking for an opportunity to get into a living cell and then utilize the parts of that living cell to do all the stuff that normal life does. Namely, the big one for viruses would be reproduce. So a virus by itself is incapable of doing that, but if that virus then comes into contact with a living thing like you or I, the virus is able to infect it, right? And we often talk about viruses as parasites for this very reason. The viruses cannot live without a host, whereas bacteria are individual living organisms that can live perfectly fine on their own. So that's really the major distinction between the two. If you wanted to think about some other distinctions, you might also think about the fact that bacteria are significantly bigger than viruses typically, although that's not always true. There are examples of bacteria that are extremely small and examples of viruses that are really big. There are big questions in biology around where did viruses come from? Did viruses evolve after normal life, or are viruses proto-life? Did viruses exist before life as we know it really came to exist? And in the last few decades especially, there's been some really cool research that has uncovered all these kinds of transitional beings, I guess you could say. And we have found creatures that seem to exist in sort of a gray area between simple bacteria and complex viruses. What we tend to try to do in science classes, especially at the middle school and high school level, is really define things very clearly. This is definitely what a virus is, and this is definitely what a bacteria is. But as we start to look at things more closely, we notice that the distinctions are not always so clear. But back to that really big point, bacteria, by and large, are normal living things like you and I. They're simple single-celled organisms, but they have all the components to do everything they need to do. Viruses lack some of those components. They're smaller. They really just have the genetic code to operate, but they need to take advantage of another living system to use all that living system's organelles or organs to function beyond their basic capacity. So.